President Paul Kagame was born on the 23rd of October 1957, the youngest of 6 children, in Urundi, a village located in what is now the southern province of Rwanda. His father, Deogratias, was a member of the Tutsi ethnic group, from which the royal family had been derived since the 18th century or earlier. His father had family ties to King Mutara III, but he pursued an independent business career rather than maintain a close connection to the royal court. Kagame's mother, Asteria, descended from the family of the last Rwandan queen, Rosalie, that is, from a branch of the royal clan. At the time of Kagame's birth, Rwanda was a United Nations Trust territory which had been ruled, in various forms, by Belgium since 1916 under a mandate to oversee eventual independence. Rwandans were made up of 3 distinct groups. The minority Tutsi were the traditional ruling class, and the Belgian colonialists had long promoted Tutsi supremacy, while the majority Hutu were agriculturalists. The third group, the Twa, were a forest-dwelling pygmy people descended from Rwanda's earliest inhabitants, who formed less than 1% of the population. Tensions between Tutsi and Hutu had been escalating during the 1950s, and culminated in the 1959 Rwandan Revolution. Hutu activists began killing Tutsi, forcing more than 100,000 Tutsis to seek refuge in neighboring countries. Kagame's family abandoned their home and lived for 2 years in the far northeast of Rwanda and eventually crossing the border into Uganda. They moved gradually north and settled in a refugee camp in the Toro sub-region in 1962. It was around this time that Kagame first met Fred Rwigema, the future leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Kagame began his primary education in a school near the refugee camp, where he and other Rwandan refugees learned how to speak English and began to integrate into Ugandan culture. At the age of 9, he moved to the respected Ruinguro Primary School, around 16 kilometers away. He subsequently attended Enter School, one of the best schools in Uganda, which was also the alma mater of future Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. According to Kagame, the death of his father in the early 1970s and the departure of Rwigema to an unknown location led to a decline in his academic performance and an increased tendency to fight those who belittled the Rwandan population. He was eventually suspended from Enter and completed his studies at Old Kampala Secondary School. After completing his education, Kagame made 2 visits to Rwanda in 1977 and 1978. He was initially hosted by family members of his former classmates, but upon arrival in Kigali, he made contact with members of his own family. He kept a low profile on these visits, believing that his status as a well-connected Tutsi exile could lead to arrest. On his second visit, he entered the country through Zaire rather than Uganda to avoid suspicion. Kagame used his time in Rwanda to explore the country, familiarize himself with the political and social situation, and make connections that would prove useful to him in his later activities. In 1978, Fred Rwigema Kagame's friend returned to western Uganda and reunited with Kagame. During his absence, Fred had joined the rebel army of Yoweri Museveni. Based in Tanzania, it aimed to overthrow the Ugandan government of Idi Amin. Fred returned to Tanzania and fought in the 1979 war, during which Museveni's rebel group, FRONASA, allied with the Tanzanian army and other Ugandan exiles, defeated Amin. After Amin's defeat, Kagame and other Rwandan refugees pledged allegiance to Museveni, who had become a cabinet member in the transition government. Kagame received training at the United States Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Former incumbent Milton Obote won the 1980 Ugandan general election. Museveni disputed the result, and he and his followers withdrew from the new government in protest. In 1981, Museveni formed the Rebel Popular Resistance Army, PRA. Kagame and Rwigema joined as founding soldiers, along with 38 Ugandans. The army's goal was to overthrow Obote's government in what became known as the Ugandan Bush War. Kagame took part in the Battle of Kabamba, the PRA's first operation, in February 1981. Kagame and Rwigema joined the PRA primarily to ease conditions for Rwandan refugees persecuted by Obote. They also had a long-term goal of returning with other Tutsi refugees to Rwanda. Military experience would enable them to fight the Hutu-dominated Rwandan army. The PRA merged with another rebel group in June 1981, forming the National Resistance Army, NRA. In the NRA, Kagame specialized in intelligence gathering, and he rose to a position close to Museveni's. The NRA, based in the Luaro Triangle, fought the Ugandan army for the next 5 years, even after Obo was deposed in a 1985 coup d'état and the start of peace talks. In 1986, the NRA captured Kampala with a force of 14,000 soldiers, including 500 Rwandans, and formed a new government. After Museveni's inauguration as president, he appointed Kagame and Rwigema as senior officers in the new Ugandan army. Kagame was the head of military intelligence, though with allegation of being trigger-happy as he could just assassinate on slight provocation. In a 2018 paper, Canadian scholar and Rwanda expert Gerald Kaplan described this appointment as a remarkable achievement for a foreigner and a refugee. Kaplan noted Museveni's reputation for toughness, and said that Kagame would have had to be similarly tough to earn such a position. He also commented on the nature of military intelligence work, saying, "It is surely unrealistic to expect that Kagame refrained from the kind of unsavory activities that military security specializes in." In addition to their army duties, Kagame and Rwigema began building a covert network of Rwandan Tutsi refugees within the army's ranks, intended as the nucleus for an attack on Rwanda. In 1989, Rwanda President Habyarimana and many Ugandans in the army began to criticize Museveni over his appointment of Rwandan refugees to senior positions, and he demoted Kagame and Fred. Kagame and Rwigema remained de facto senior officers, but the change caused them to accelerate their plans to invade Rwanda. They joined an organization called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a refugee association which had been operating under various names since 1979. Rwigema became the RPF leader shortly after joining and, while still working for the Ugandan army, he and Kagame completed their invasion plans. Rwandan Civil War. In October 1990, Rwigema led a force of over 4,000 RPF rebels into Rwanda at the Kagitumba border post, advancing 60 kilometers south to the town of Gabiro. Kagame was not present at the initial raids, as he was in the United States, attending the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. On the second day of the attack, Rwigema was shot in the head and killed. The exact circumstances are disputed. The official line of Kagame's government, and the version mentioned by historian Gerard Prunier in his 1995 book on the subject, was that Rwigema was killed by a stray bullet. In his 2009 book Africa's World War, Prunier says Rwigema was killed by his subcommander Peter Bayingana, following an argument over tactics. According to this account, Bayingana and fellow subcommander Chris Bunyanyeji were then executed on the orders of Museveni. In a 2005 conversation with Kaplan, Prunier provided a different account, stating that Bayingana and Bunyanyezi's killers were recruited by Kagame. Kaplan notes that lack of research means the truth of this is uncertain, but that if true, the tales of death and intrigue offer yet another insight into Kagame's character. Fred's death threw the RPF into confusion. France and Zaire deployed forces in support of the Rwandan army, and by the end of October, the RPF had been pushed back into the far northeast corner of the country. Kagame returned to Africa and took command of the RPF forces, which had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 troops. Kagame and his soldiers moved west, through Uganda, to the Virunga Mountains, a rugged high-altitude area where the terrain worked in their favor. From there, he rearmed and reorganized the army, and carried out fundraising and recruitment from the Tutsi diaspora. Kagame restarted combat in January 1991, with an attack on the northern town of Ruhengeri. Benefiting from the element of surprise, the RPF captured the town and held it for a day before retreating back into the forests. For the next year, the RPF waged a hit-and-run guerrilla war, capturing some border areas but not making significant gains against the Rwandan army. These actions caused an exodus of around 300,000 Hutu from the affected areas. Prunier wrote in 1995 that the RPF were surprised that Hutu peasants showed no enthusiasm for being liberated by them, in her 2018 book In Praise of Blood. However, Canadian journalist Judy Reaver quoted witnesses who said that the exodus was forced by RPF attacks on the villages, including the laying of landmines and shooting of children. Kaplan's paper questions the credibility of many of the witnesses Reaver had spoken to, but noted that there are considerable other sources besides Reaver that attest to RPF war crimes. Following the June 1992 formation of a multi-party coalition government in Kigali, Kagame announced a ceasefire and initiated negotiations with the Rwandan government in Arusha, Tanzania. In early 1993, groups of extremist Hutu formed and began campaigns of large-scale violence against the Tutsi. Kagame responded by suspending peace talks temporarily and launching a major attack, gaining a large swath of land across the north of the country. Peace negotiations resumed in Arusha, and the resulting set of agreements, known as the Arusha Accords, were signed in August 1993. The RPF were given positions I,